anyways, back to the evidence. In-depth hematological reports show that the blood on the cloth is AB, which is consistent with what we think Jesus's blood would be, but there's so much more. There's pre and post-mortem blood, and in addition to that, the blood tells a story of trauma, inflammation, and dehydration. All of that corresponds with the trauma that we know his body suffered. The blood on the shroud soaks all the way through. Jesus lost a lot of blood. However, the image on the shroud is superficial. The very best scientists in the world cannot reproduce it. And trust me, they've tried. The wounds shown on the image, as well as the blood pattern, perfectly line up with what the Bible describes, because we know that some parts of Jesus's torture prior to crucifixion and like the crown of thorns were specific to Jesus's torture and crucifixion. There's estimated to be about 700 wounds on Jesus, on this crucified man depicted on the shroud. So let's go through and break them down. So we know that prior to Jesus even going up on the cross, he was tortured. He was flogged and scourged. He was blindfolded, remember, and they were hitting him and saying, prophesy, tell us who's hitting you. We also know from scripture that Jesus was made to carry the cross beam over to where he was going to ultimately be crucified, and that he was so weak from being bludgeoned and tortured that he couldn't carry it on his own and he fell. On the Shroud of Turin, scientists have been able to identify not only the beam marks in his flesh from carrying this very heavy crossbeam, but also they were able to find dirt and pollen samples specific to the region on his feet, his knees, and on his nose from him falling on his face. As far as the crucifixion itself, we know that the Romans would drive nails, 6-inch long iron spikes through the wrists and the hands, as well as the heels, straddling either side of that middle beam of the cross. Those wounds are consistent with the image and the blood patterning on the shroud. Then, of course, there is the crown of thorns. And we remember from scripture that Jesus was put in a purple robe, and the soldiers had made this, they weaved together this crown of thorns to put on him to mock him, saying, "All hail the King of the Jews." Growing up in Catholic Church, I remember there was a Jesus hanging on the cross up at the front of my church, and you see Jesus and he's got this little halo of thorns, like rose bush thorns going around his head. That is not at all what this crown was. And I'm going to put it here, what the crown actually looked like. It was more like a helmet. These are ginormous thorns, and this helmet was shoved into his skull.